The reason it's so important we all come together is that we really do have to collaborate and share the information that we have. That's the way we're really going to all come together as a community, deal with family violence, and hopefully put an end to it. It's going to take a long time, but if we can come together and work collaboratively, we have a dream, it's going to happen, and I'm sure you're all in that for the same reason. You heard Deanne talk about the Hear Her Voice report. That came about as a result of the Hannah Clark trial. I just recently reread the 165 pages that was put out by the coroner, Jane Bentley. Just for a bit of historical background, Jane was actually local council in Cairns, so that's why I was certainly very interested to hear her summation and recommendations. And knowing Jane, and towards the end, you could hear the emotion in her voice as she delivered her recommendations. One of the recommendations was really about having this multidisciplinary team, and talked about having the police, having your lawyers, people from child safety, Act for Kids, the perpetrators group. There's a lot of good men's group out there, so we've all got to work together, and that was such a strong recommendation of hers after that. What came about then after Hear Her Voice report was the task force, and I just wanted to perhaps say, before I move on to the role of independent children's lawyer, the artwork was brilliant on that task force. It's 3 volumes, it's thousands and thousands of pages. So again, just over the weekend, I needed to reread it to sort of understand what I could help you with today. But with the artwork, they'd say that the artwork as a whole represents the journey we must go on as a community to protect and better the lives of women and girls and make the world a fairer place for them. It represents the mountains we must climb and the perseverance and determination it takes to make this a reality. So this morning at 4 o'clock, I thought I would get that lovely artwork in colour and have it for you. So I Googled mountains, and of course I just got photos of mountains. So I'm sorry to disappoint you, but have a look at that, the task force, and look at the front page. It is really quite empowering what that all means. Before I get on to my role as an independent children's lawyer, I just want to touch on an area of family violence that I'm seeing that kids are reporting to me that probably isn't in the handout, and it's animal cruelty. The children have, they talk about witnessing some of the family violence between mum and dad. They don't understand coercive control, but we're certainly now understanding it, we hope. But it's the pets, what's happening to their dogs, more so than it seems to be the cats. And unfortunately, it does seem to be a lot happening with dads, because that's their world. When mum and dad's falling apart, it's the pets that they're turning to. Some horrific stories, not just the kicking and throwing the dog across the pool, but it's actually cutting the dog up, hanging the dog in a tree. And these kids were just traumatised, and that's going to be an impact for them for a long, long time. The other area that I just wanted to touch on too, in terms of the violence, is this systems abuse. It's happening in our courts. I don't know if many of you heard or saw that ABC report, where it was a criticism of a family report writer. What was interesting at the end of that report, though, was a commentary by Pascoe, who was our Chief Justice of the Family Court, actually critical of the Family Court, suggesting that the Family Court's not quite getting some of this violence, and was suggesting that there should be one court, because we have the state courts that will deals with child protection matters. You've got state courts dealing with family violence matters. But then we move across to the Family Court, and under the Family Law Act, Best Principles for Children, is this meaningful relationship between both parents. I mean, yes, it also has to be kept safe, but what came out of the task force was a lot of criticism that litigants in the Family Court were feeling as though they weren't being heard, that the family violence wasn't being really taken to the degree it should be, at the risk of children having to have that meaningful relationship with the perpetrator. So it'll be interesting to see where that moves to. Just on your table is a book that I've co-written about Silence or Stand. So it does take you through the history of family law in Cairns, some of the changes that we've seen. But I just wanted to then move away from that, and then with the systems abuse, it's a trial that I was involved in, so I can say the name because it was reported in the full court. It was a matter of Thea Payne and Hunt. And I know there's a practitioner in this room who worked closely with me when we were doing that trial. And interesting, she presents a bit of a play after it. But it had such an impact on me in that the background behind it is there's a lot of litigation going on in Victoria, Cairns Court, in the Supreme Court, in the Family Violence Court, in the Family Court, Federal Court. There was actions all around Australia, and that's one of the things with our Federal Act, is that you can have actions in different states of Australia. But what happened in that one is that the mother had been pushed to such an extent from the violence during the relationship, and there had been the allegations of rape, deprivation of liberty, assaults, that she goes into a dissociative state and she actually attempts to stab Dad. So, of course, immediate concern, the child's taken out of her care and is placed in the care of the father. We then go through a process in trying to understand this dissociative state she'd been in. When she was about 6 years of age, her brother went missing. They were living in Mackay at the time. And she just remembers a lot of crying and anger in her home, and then her brother being returned, and there was this cross on his forehead, and that's where the person who had grabbed him had said that he would put a bullet hole through that cross if he was to say what happened. So she lived with that. Then she meets this man, has a child to him, and sometime later she's in another relationship and has a young boy. At one of the changeovers, the father of her elder child is standing over her. He's a tall man, standing over her and saying, "This boy's going to go missing. He's going to be taken." And she said as much as she had all that violence during the relationship, this was something different. His whole presentation, that she really feared that he was going to take this child. They were in a park, no one else was around. And it was that night she just went into that dissociative state, comes down, tries to stab him. And of course the family court is concerned, well, if she's in that state, what capacity does she have to care for that child? So we then go through a process of years of litigation. It took 10 years of my life. It was just constant. Every month or so he brought another application in the court. So this is the systems abuse. That she was then having to constantly respond to. Ultimately, at a final trial, the child's returned to mum. But during that trial, and it's one of these ones with some of the parenting matters, that they are difficult, they're complicated, that I had briefed Silk, and you don't always brief a Silk in a parenting matter. My counsel's on her feet. Father at that time self-represented, and it was prior to what's now brought in is the banning of cross-examination. So he was arguing with the judge should recuse himself, he's biased. It was also during that trial he was able to cross-examine mum. Now thankfully that doesn't happen now when there's family violence. What has come through is a section that we call 102NA, I know that's legal terms, but it means it's a banning order, that when perpetrators cannot cross-examine the aggrieved. So that's been a change that has happened. But during this trial, my counsel's on my feet. We're before a family court judge, and the judge just stops and puts his hand up and says, "Miss McMillan, before you go any further, I'm going to have to stop you there. Can you have your instructor see to her client? I turned around and our client is in a fetal position in the courtroom. So the court stopped. In the court system, they do have family court counsellors. She came up to the court, tried to talk to our client, couldn't bring her around. So she'd gone back into this disassociative state. I then had to take her up to the mental health ward. And what really struck me is just how well these people dealt with that. And just recently I looked up a journal, and it's the Australian Journal of General Practitioners. And in that, it talks about how you talk to some of these trauma victims. You're not my lawyer talk, for God's sake, get yourself together or in court. Whilst I'm up at the mental health ward with my client, he brings an urgent application that the child should go immediately into his care. She's not well. So it was just so heartwarming to see these people talk to her, but they were firm. And it's just the type of questions they were asking her. It's the gentleness in their voice that we brought her through. And we're back in court that next day, and we're able to continue with the trial. But what was interesting, in that matter, we had an absolutely brilliant family report writer, and her evidence was that this mother, every time she was coming into contact with the father, it was akin to a soldier going on a battlefield. And there was no way that we could get past that until the litigation was over. So that was a matter that ultimately we were able to get an order that the father wasn't to have contact with the child, because the report writer's view was that the father had such an anti-personality disorder that it was going to cause more harm for this child to have time with him than it was to completely stop the time. As I say, it was and it went on appeal. Ultimately, we're also able to get an order, and that's where I bring in this systems abuse, was that he was declared a vexatious litigant, so he couldn't keep come back to court. It was a hard trial, but it's just one that will stand out in my mind. Now, when you're listening to Deanne, I mean, yes, we have hard cases, but so do all you. You deal with these people. It's not just us as lawyers. We do the law. You guys have the hardcore, the emotion. So I just want to touch base, and when Deanne said that we were going to present something today, I thought, great, I'm going to talk about vicarious trauma, and Dee said, that's not our grad, so I had to pull back. I just hope you all have that peer group that you can turn to, that you have that support, because vicarious trauma can really have an impact on you. And I know myself, I've been doing this for 43 years. I'm in a matter at the moment where I go home and I'm thinking about it, the court's got it wrong, the report writer's got it wrong. Talk to your peer group. Really don't let, you've got to make sure it doesn't get to you, because you've got to go on for the next hard case. So just moving on from there, let me talk about the role of an independent children's lawyer. It's one I'm very passionate about. You're advocate for the children, and your role is to get before the court their best interest. Now, as that role, we're appointed by the court. Our funding comes from legal aid. We meet with the child. We issue a number of subpoenas, and subpoenas are to, and as child safety, as you probably all say, here we go again, Babs issuing subpoenas. The subpoenas go to child safety. Subpoenas will go to the Department of Education, goes to the police. And that's how we get all the independent evidence before the court. I at times might talk to the teachers. If the children are in sport, I'll talk to their coach. I'll talk to their counsellors. And that's why I said to Deanne, as an independent children's lawyer, everyone wants to talk to you because they want to tell you what I should be doing for the children. Some of the harder ones, and it's one I'm facing at the moment, and I'm not the independent children's lawyer, I'm acting for a mum. Maybe I'm not being terribly objective. But the independent children's lawyer has just taken the view, in this particular case, I'm not going to look at the best wishes, I'm looking at risk. So just getting back to the role of the independent children's lawyer, you're not there just to say what the children want. And having said that, I've had some difficult matters where, and the difficulty with the family court, it was a one where mum had taken off with the child, dad didn't know where the child was for a long, long time. finally finds out we're in the court, judge didn't like mum, and of course was making it very clear that she was going to make orders that the child live with dad. The child had told me very clearly she wants to continue to live with mum. What was interesting though, because interim orders were made, and then sometime later the child was saying, oh, actually, Dad's not a bad guy. He does all the work. Mum told me he never worked. But she still wanted to live with her mum. The final orders went against her wishes. I had to meet with her and let her know that the orders were that she was to live with Dad. Oh, she was angry at me. She said, I told you. And she had to go through it. Ultimately, it probably took 8 months. The father rang and said she hasn't settled in. She really wants to be with mum. I'm going to let her go. Now, that's the insight of a father that didn't want to put her under any more stress. Yes, I met with her again, but I made it. You know, she was really open then with me in that it did teach her something. It taught her Dad wasn't a bad guy. She got on well with him. She even sort of at times I probably had to apologise for Dad. I was rude because all I wanted to do was go back to mum. So it's hard for kids. It's that emotional impact that she had to go through. Just in terms of then with your role, as I say, I've been around for a long time. That's why I wrote the history. Prior to 2006, the Family Law Act did not recognise the impact on a child if they witnessed family violence. I had a matter that I'd been involved with for 14 years. The little boy was 2 when I first met him. The daughter was probably 10, 11, and there was another child in between. In that matter, the daughter says and tells me how the father had pushed mum through the plate glass, broke the plate glass, blood everywhere. She had to clean it up. Her 2 younger brothers are under the dining room table. They saw it. I'm arguing with my barrister. This is not right. The children have seen it. Bev, you know what the Act says. The Act does not acknowledge that if the violence hasn't been towards the children, then the contact orders have to be made. Well, I got on the Family Law Council committee and I was vocal. We have, the Family Law Council is top. I was on the country as country representative. And to do that, we bring to the top Family Law Council concerns we have in our regional areas. And this was something I was raising. This was so wrong. The Family Law Act has not got it right. Ultimately, Family Law Council meets with the Attorney General and the Family Law Act is changed. And you that work with children know that if the children are witnessing family violence, that has an enormous impact on them. Unfortunately, Family Law Act didn't get it. I was criticised by my barrister, but ultimately I had the final win. So we now have a breakthrough. But here we are now. We're now going through yet another stage of the coercive control. The family court's not getting it. I'll be criticised by that, but at the moment they're not getting it. And Deanne said the same thing. It's going to take a while. We need groups like you to work with us as lawyers to help us get through this. And I'm hoping eventually it will. And that was, I guess that's really what came with the Hannah Clark trial and the task force. There was some really, I suppose, poignant comments made by people going through this coercive control made in that task force. And I was going to quote some of them, but I'm not. I think we've had a heavy enough morning. We'll just leave it at that. But what I was interested in the task force, they came to Cairns. This was a group that came about as a result of Hear Her Voice. And the comment in the task force is that they were really impressed by the Cairns commitment to family violence. Now, I wasn't asked. Who else? Who was asked? Anyone in this room? Consulted by the task force when they came here 2 years ago, maybe? So I'm dying to know who they were. But anyway, look, we're all here for that purpose. So let's join together. Let's collaborate. One of the criticism, though, whoever it was that they spoke to, had said, though, that we're not sharing the information, that they say that there's some holdback in their department, that they can't share information with the other department. So I guess we need to work with that. And I need to hear from you. If you've got that concern that we can't share information, let me know. I'll take it to the Family Law Council. We've really got to work together to be able to get through this next hurdle. Now, in terms of then my role as we issue the subpoenas, we get this information. It is very much, now I'm not saying that the judges always take on board what the independent children's lawyer will say, because I have to say where that decision was made against that 13, 14-year-old child, that wasn't my case before the court. I was sort of saying that your mum had learnt a lesson, but there needed to be regular time with Dad because this girl had really formed a bond with Dad. But having said that, I now get back to that matter that in prior to 2006, the courts weren't acknowledging impact of family violence on children. The daughter, who was 10 or 11, I still remember her school uniform, I won't say what school she was from, came into my office and gave me her assignment and said, "Bev, I want you to read this." She was pretty angry with me. I read it, and it was about the violence. It's what she saw her dad do it. She saw her brothers crying under the table, and then yet it goes to the court. And the representative for me made recommendations that the child, well, not recommendations, but the orders were for her younger brothers to continue to see her father. I was bound by the Family Law Act then. This young girl went overseas, came back as an adult, called on me again, and we had a chat about it. And I said to her, you know, your matter was one that I talked to the higher level in that I got on a Family Law Council. You made me do something about this, and ultimately the Act has changed, that it recognised what your brothers had gone through. What was interesting though also about that time, there was a child psychologist that came to Cairns, and there was only 2 lawyers in the room. The rest were nurses, social scientists, doctors, and he was telling us about the frontal lobe and the impact that it has on young children when they see this family violence. And that's when I started learning about extrinsic and intrinsic memories, and I'm not going to take you through that because you're probably far better than I at what that means. But it was interesting, and that's what really got me going in terms of going to the Family Law Council. There has to be changes. Just moving on, I had a tragic matter as an independent children's lawyer, and I guess that's why I was really interested in the Hannah Clark matter and reading it. And just on that Hannah Clark matter, I just wanted to perhaps read to you that in the 4 months before the homicide-suicide, both the parents and the children had been in contact with a range of services, and it lists them: Queensland Police, Department of Child Safety, Centre for Women, Vision Psychology, Brisbane Domestic Violence, Family Mediation, general practitioners, doctors, Relationships Australia, Men's Legal and Men's Line. And in fact, just before the father drives to the mother's residence and parks outside, he rang Men's Line, he rang Men's Legal Service just to get help. Not to say that's what he was going to do, but he wanted to log in with them that he was following through recommendations that he had to sort of go through with programs. I just simply raise that because that's the number of agencies that they had been in contact with before that tragic event. So it can be something that you or might be involved in at some stage, so we do need to be aware. But I then want to move on to, it was a matter that I was first appointed. The role of the independent children's lawyer came about in 1994. It was a case of Ree Kay. Now in that case, the judge found, on a balance of probabilities, in the family court we don't have that criminal element that we have to find beyond reasonable doubt. So the judge had found on a balance of probabilities that the husband had shot the wife. He killed her. The children knew the paternal family, but the judge ultimately ordered that the children live with the maternal family in America. And that's when they started talking about independents having views of children before the court. So that brought about the role of the independent children's lawyer. Then with the matter I had, the two boys, they're only quite young. They were just toddlers when I was first appointed. I met with them, but with the report writer. There's not a lot I can do as a lawyer, 2-year-old, 3-year-old, little blonde boys. Then the family court proceedings were on hold for a bit because the mother had brought rape charges, the father went through a rape trial and he was acquitted. So then we're back in the family court again. All through Mum's proceedings, she never ever said she was concerned about the father committing violence towards the boys. Her concern was she had a daughter from another relationship, and her concern was that the father had been inappropriate towards the daughter. The daughter was of an age where she was saying she didn't want to particularly to have contact with him. So it was nothing about violence with these boys. We finally get to they reached consent orders, Mum and Dad, and the interim consent orders was for Dad to have supervised time with these boys during the September holidays. Now the boys are now 9 and 10. So that's how long I can be involved in families for as an independent children's lawyer. He's having his supervised time. It was agreed that the supervisor would be his girlfriend. Now we very rarely will have a partner as a supervisor. But having said that, Mum and Dad consented to these orders, and Mum quite liked the new girlfriend and didn't have concerns with her being a supervisor. Unfortunately, during the September holidays, Dad and the girlfriend have an argument. And the girlfriend says, "Well, I'm going to say you interfered with my daughters." It was after that that tipped the father over the edge. He burns the house, shoots the dog, shoots the boys, shoots himself. I'm called to give evidence at the coronial hearing, and that's when we have to put in place, was I negligent? And gee, I did a lot of inner searching of myself. What did I miss? But we had a family report, someone who was top of his game, Brisbane forensic psychologist. Nothing in the report was any concerns even about Mum saying Dad would cause violence to these children. It was all about perhaps that sexual impropriety, there'd been the rape charges, they couldn't communicate. We had a psychiatric assessment from a well-known psychiatrist, did not pick up that, I suppose, sense that the father was a risk to the boys. So this happens, it's just one of those things that we just didn't pick up. So you all just have to be quite alert with that. Look, I went through soul searching. Am I going to continue to do this? How could I miss it? Met with the psychologist, flew up from Brisbane, psychiatrist, we all met. The solicitor for the mum, solicitor for the dad, and really sort of went through a bit of a debriefing. So I can't stress that enough, to debrief with your colleagues. So then, moving on from that, what I'm seeing more so now with the children that I'm acting for is they're being diagnosed with ADHD, ADD, autism. They're having problems at school, and these are the kids who are witnessing family violence. So I'm sure you people probably work with a lot of these kids, and they're having to get then report from the counsellors, and so it's just that level that you're seeing with these children now. Even then, perhaps moving on from, in terms of the community, and we've got social workers here, psychologists, people working with children. Recently I was asked to give a talk to some real estate agents, so it's happening within the community. And it was in the task force as well, that a real estate agent who had been just going around doing the house calls, they had this family's rent roll. He actually happened to look through the screen door and saw a woman chained to a chair. So he then contacts the appropriate departments. So it's happening in, I guess, the commercial world as well. And the Residential Tenancies Act has changed a bit to accommodate that if you're in family violence, you can give notice to quit, 7 days, whereas prior to that, I mean, if they had a lease, they're bound by the lease. But I'm getting real estate agents in Cairns contacting me about that and who can they go to. And of course, we're all probably aware of difficulty at the moment with rentals in Cairns. So again, it's just trying to bring the community together to work with that. Perhaps then, moving on. What's the time? How are we going? Oh, all right. You sure? Okay. I suppose I just wanted to also touch on some of those difficult matters. In a matter that I did have, the mother had been through dreadful trauma. I wasn't the independent children's lawyer in that matter. And she kept saying, "Oh, I can't." The little fella, he was 5. He can't go to Dad. I couldn't get any information from her. As I say, father had started the proceedings because he wanted to have time with the boy. I was able to quickly get some subpoenas issued because she was telling me that she was working with Dad. They were going to counsellors, and she was able to say, look, he'd hit his head against the wall. So in front of, it was little boy 5, and she had daughters from previous relationship, hitting himself against the wall. He's marching up and down the street, yelling out, puts a gun on the table. It's not loaded, but the kids get frightened. And then the violent acts start. He also had a brain injury from an accident, but I couldn't get this information from her. So she would make an appointment to come and see me. We had deadlines to meet. We had to get a response in, get her affidavit in. And bless my staff, sometimes they think I'm a machine. I've got appointments 9 o'clock, 10:30, 11, 12, and I've got to get her whole story in an hour. So I set aside a couple of weekends, and she came in on the weekends. But by this stage, I had some independent information. I had the responses from subpoenas, the reports from psychologists saying, yes, they had come to see her, and the father he was yelling at the kids, he was threatening to kill the kids, bashing head against the wall. But Mum couldn't tell me that. So I had to take her through it. And that's how I was able to get that affidavit. But that's weekends work. That's not happening in the norms of what we've got to try and do in an office. But again, I'm not telling a lot of you anything because you deal with that firsthand. And I keep going back to that journal I read on just how a lot of you deal with children in this situation, families in this situation, and I congratulate you. Good on you. My lawyer brain ticks. And I need people like you to help me get families through this situation. Then just in, suppose, I just wanted to touch base with this parental alienation because what I'm gradually now seeing is with the coercive control, we're raising coercive control, and then because it's not being pleaded clearly, and that's what Deanne was trying to take you through, we can't just say this happened. You've got to try to be specific with the time, and coercive control is constant, so you've got to go through that. But what the courts are sort of coming from, and I'm finding even other independent children's lawyers, report writers, are then sort of taking the view, oh, that's mum alienating the children. So we now have this concept coming in again of parental alienation. So it is important to try to work with these people to help them through that next stage. So am I over? Okay. Well, I might, there's lots of other stuff I wanted to say, but Deanne has really covered it. And we'll pass on to Dee then for the next stage.